My name is Claudio Acioly. I'm a senior housing expert of UN Habitat, the United Nations Human Settlement Program based in Nairobi. For a number of years, I was the head of housing policy, coordinator of the UN Housing Rights Program, and also supervising an advisory group on forced evictions to the executive director of UN Habitat. Housing rights and accessibility to affordable housing lies very deep in my heart and in my professional interests before and during my tenure in UN Habitat. It is for me a great honor to speak in the 21st Congress of the International Union of Tenants. And it's even for me a great pleasure to read that the Agenda 2030, and particularly the SDG 11 that wishes to create cities that are sustainable, resilient, and safe, and inclusive, is part and parcel of the agenda of this Congress. For people like ourselves who have an interest on housing and understand the fundamental importance of housing in producing prosperity, welfare, and well-being of the population, working in the Agenda 2030 and seeing this the most ambitious agenda of humanity, considering two aspects for those who work in cities are fundamental. The quality of life, which means public space, the way we plan and design cities, but also the way we finance and produce housing opportunities and housing options for different groups in cities. So for the first time in history, these issues are part and parcel of the agenda for sustainable development of our planet. This puts a lot of importance and a lot of responsibilities on our work, on the way we deal with our constituent groups, but also the way we deal with governments and making policies being more focused on issues that have a direct impact in the quality of life of the inhabitants. And affordability and the accessibility to affordable housing is an important element. But more important in your agenda is to which extent the provision of affordable housing, and in particularly the availability of rental housing in a city, can contribute to the achievement of this ambitious agenda, and particularly the SDG 11. Now we need to discuss with governments to make understanding that in the availability of different options and different tenure of housing will play a role in the way people will choose or have opportunities to choose in the places where they are able to pay or places where they are enabled to live, creating cities that are inclusive and not cities that exclude the poor to peripheral areas or to poor housing. And I'm glad that the IUT takes this very serious, promotes this agenda, because the affordability of rental housing in the housing sector in general will allow us to address fundamentally the SDG 11.2, which means providing affordable housing for the wide groups of the population. And rental housing, as I said, play a fundamental role. Why? And why should we insist that in several countries we should provide this option of renting? Because it allows the young adults first to emancipate, giving opportunities that they can start their life independently. It promotes labor mobility, so people are not stuck to a particular housing when they get a loan, they buy the house, and sometimes it's very difficult to move when you move jobs because housing markets are unpredictable, and it gives that incentive for different options for those who are temporarily in a place or they want to live in a particular area, and you provide the possibilities, the policies promote social mix in cities, which are important for social cohesion and human development cities. So overall, my message to you is that we need to create an agenda that transpire to policymakers, to politicians, that they understand not only the role of housing, but the role of different tenure in this variety of options that policies can provide for people to access adequate and affordable housing. And I'm very, very happy to see this issue being addressed by an organization. And we should also reflect in those countries where social protection and social securities are not in place, because this is where people don't seem to look at, let's say, options of rental housing as a way to access a good place to live, adequate living, welfare. Why? Because in many of the countries we work, people have this ambition to be homeowner, because in case they pass away, their families have a roof on top of their heads. And this is common, and we see that often and often. And I think we need to promote, together with various tenures and various options of affordable housing, also mechanisms of social protection, so that people actually will have the freedom to decide whether they want to rent or they want to buy. With all, it's a big discussion, it's a quick message, but I hope it makes sense for you, and I wish you a good Congress and a productive discussions, and that the deliberations will reach a broader public, so that we can start a big movement for promoting affordable housing for all in this planet. Thank you.
First, and then dinner for all of you. Or you can get a taxi. And now I get the signal from the back here that we're ready to go. So we have Ellen Geurts, who is a Dutch housing expert whose career spans for more than 15 years in the international arena as an expert associated with the Rotterdam-based Institute for Housing and Urban Development. She came on short notice, and I'm delighted that she flew in this morning and staying with us today until she's back to her university students tomorrow. So please join us, Ellen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It came at quite short notice through also Claudio, but thank you very much for inviting me here. When Claudio also approached me to talk here, obviously it's about the SDG 11. I'm going to talk about that more, about housing, but also about affordability and justice, because that is a topic I've been working at. I'm not sure whether all of you, probably most of you, are not actually familiar with the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies. As an institute, we're associated with the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, based in the Netherlands, and our focus is really on training and capacity building, with a focus geographically, in fact, on the global south. And the mission also of the IHS is to reduce the poverty and to improve the quality of life in cities. So although I'm based in the Netherlands, and I was talking also to some other Dutch colleagues here, actually my work experience has been predominantly across the globe, and in particular Global South, and in my personal experience actually predominantly in Sub-Saharan Africa and Central and Eastern European countries. And I'm going to address the SDG 11, I'm going to address the issue of housing sustainable communities. But in particular, I'm going to address the issues focusing on housing affordability and justice. And I think in particular that last topic of justice is quite well noted, because through the course of this afternoon, I've been hearing a lot here about housing as a right. And that's also what we see. Housing Housing is a commodity. It's also a commodity, but it's first and foremost, it's a housing right. So in all our efforts, in all our research and capacity building, what I'm predominantly working on, we are trying to seek how do we ensure that right? How do we find, and that's what we're actually been working on within the IHS, how do we find then housing justice? And actually on that, the SDGs, not only the SDGs, also the New Urban Agenda, the attention also for finding the sustainable future through the Paris Climate Agreement, but also the Addis Ababa Agenda for Financing for Development, the Sandy Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. All these international agreements and these international agendas, they are a recognition and a commitment for our sustainable future, in which also now, through the latest SDGs, and in particular in SDG 11, cities and urbanization are really put at the forefront of the agenda. I will remind you that before we had the SDGs, we worked towards working the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs. What was not specifically MDGs was so much the issue of housing as such. It was about slum upgrading, but really what the SDGs have achieved is that now urbanization and housing is much more at the forefront of the agenda. And what the SDGs do is they provide us a blueprint for action. They provide governments a blueprint for action. And the main mission behind those SDGs is that, yes, we want a clean, safe, and just world for everyone. And the motto behind that is to leave no one behind. And for me, that is an important message to once more re-emphasize, because leaving no one behind, that means also enshrining that housing right. But how to achieve that? How to achieve that clean, safe, and just world for everyone? How do we ensure that we leave no one behind? First of all, it's important that through your organization, through events like this, through also knowledge sharing, we share international knowledge. We share our experiences. We share what we know. We share how we respond. But we also work. We all come from different societies. We come from different backgrounds. We present different groups of society, but also in different localities. So it also means that we need local responses. So if we want to achieve a clean and safe, just world for everyone, the responses here in Vienna might be rather different than, say, for instance, in Accra or in Bangladesh, in Dhaka. Yeah? We require different solutions. Within the SDG 11, I think an important element of this is that it really focuses on sustainable cities and sustainable communities. So what the SDGs really therefore put at the forefront is the element of the urbanization. Cities are really now at the forefront of our development. And we see that also increasingly, that cities are the engine. They're the engine for development. Cities are taking up initiatives to collaborate together. It's not necessarily your national governments that are always involved. I mean, we heard a wonderful example today from how Vienna is dealing with it, which is maybe stepping up a different mark, doing something differently than is maybe happening at the national level here, also in Austria. I don't know enough about Austria to really comment on that. And it's also not only about sustainable cities, it's also about sustainable communities. So how do we involve those communities? How do we ensure that the SDG 11 is really targeted and implemented by an approach whereby communities are really given the floor, really are included? In particular, in a time, and the housing, the 2019 State of Housing in Europe report actually also pointed it out a couple of days ago, especially at a time where the social divide is growing. So in this time where the social divide is growing, it's even more important to really ensure that sustainable communities are at the heart of achieving sustainable cities. Within this SDG 11, as Claudio also already pointed out, the target really around safe and affordable housing is key. if we want to achieve sustainable cities, and I don't have to convince any of you, I think, on this, housing plays a key role. Housing is also at the forefront of the new urban agenda. But what is it, when do we achieve? Now, when do we achieve safe and affordable housing then? And what is it if we're talking about realizing adequate housing? When is housing adequate? And for whom? Who decides on this? And is there a universal understanding of this, or does this really require a local contextualization? Well, at the IHS, we've worked a lot on capacity building, and we do research and advisory work also around this topic. And whenever we're asked to work on developing an affordable housing strategy, an adequate housing strategy, we always ask the question, but how can it work in this local context? What is the framework you need in this specific context? And that's also about how we're going to achieve this target one, and this is the crux, I think, of this blueprint of the SDGs. It's a blueprint that has been signed off by national governments, but it's to be implemented at the local level. And how do we do that? And what do people require? Because, and now I'm going to talk you through a few countries that are none of them represented here, but they're actually countries where I contributed to and worked on the social housing sector or affordable housing sector. And the issues are so different. The needs of people are very different. These are some examples from Sint Maarten. Many of you might not know it. The Dutch here will for sure know it. It's a country within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. It's actually a tiny island in the Caribbean, which is even shared between the French and the Dutch. So it's, if it comes to size, it's actually a municipality. They have a social housing model which is very much along the lines of the Dutch social housing model. It also being a country part of our kingdom, of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. But as many of you may know, 2 years ago it was hit by a hurricane, and since then rebuilding and adapting actually to this hurricane, because these hurricanes, they just escaped one. Dorian hit the Bahamas, but it escaped Sint Maarten. The adaptability of these houses is at the first and foremost concern of tenants here at present. Looking at the institutional structures, which were also earlier mentioned, if you look at it, it's a tiny island, so it makes sense on the one hand. There's only one institution providing social housing there. We were talking earlier about rent control. If we look at the case at Sint Maarten, there's rent control actually in the sense that rent has not been increased for the last 20 years. What does that say? That's going to create a problem. I think from Portugal, you're already shaking your head. So what Sint Maarten needs is something else. Looking at a country like Myanmar, we earlier on talked about inclusionary housing policies. Actually, inclusionary housing policies are part of the new policies being developed by the government in Myanmar. But at the same time, what you see at the bottom left is the old housing being partitioned, tenants living in very overcrowded, very unsafe habitations. And the new housing, what you see on the right being developed, this is a sort of inclusionary housing policy that are now being developed. But actually, if you look at it, it doesn't even show maybe that well, but the type of housing, this enormous high rise, and maybe you don't even see that well, but some of these are sort of literally, they're your handshake apartment flats, and I could show you worse pictures from all over Asia, where literally tenants could almost shake each other's hands across the balcony, because they're that densely built and that close to each other, because land comes at a premium. Are these solutions acceptable? This is not even about whether it's affordable or whether it's there, but is it also acceptable? Then the case of South Africa. In this case, I'm showing you an example from a social housing project in South Africa, where, because this is downtown Johannesburg, one of the primary concerns and the main concerns here is really about access into the building. That's why I also have those pictures up there about the physical access to the building, because safety is the prime concern here. What is very nice about this particular project is that safety and accessibility is addressed here, but also what was addressed here is affordability. One thing that obviously the affordability issue has come up here, is that affordability is still, it remains one of our biggest concerns and one of our biggest challenges. And what we often see is when people fall out of the system, they move up, they move down the ladder, they have to move down the ladder. What this particular project shows you, and I haven't seen many of them, and that's why I always sort of want to show it, is that this addresses actually also people falling down the housing ladder. So in this project, you see everything from a 2 to 3 bedroom apartment to an overnight shelter. So people move to the city, they hopefully start an overnight shelter, move into their own studio, ultimately maybe move into their 1, 2, 3 bedroom apartment. But when they get stuck on the ladder, when they get stuck in their income, they can also move down that ladder. And that is something that is often not foreseen in projects, that you can move up and down again. Albania, a country where we worked in particular, and if I say it political correct, I should make a very long sentence, but basically we work with the Roma population. When it comes to making a housing strategy for the Roma population in Albania, the main issue that these people experiences are access, or in fact what their experiences are exclusion. Many people cannot be registered within a municipality, in the municipality where they're living. So how do they even make sure that they even move into social housing, which you see in the bigger picture that is being provided, when access is not possible? So working on all these projects at the IHS, and following also from this whole debate on adequate housing and how do we achieve adequate housing, we started to develop within the Institute a framework that we call the Principles of Adequate Housing, and we call it the 5A approach. Well, it's the 5A approach because ultimately we felt that it came down to realizing adequate housing as an instrument to develop policies, but also as an instrument to conduct research and to understand our quest for ultimately finding housing justice. There were 5 principles that each time came to the fore. The aim in these principles is indeed to develop that notion of housing justice. I don't know yet what housing justice is, as in the sense that it's not a defined topic. But when I hear you talking here today about housing rights, I know we mean by that also housing justice. But how do we really understand housing justice as an outcome of policies? How do we hold also policymakers responsible for really achieving and enshrining these housing justice? Is that fulfilling the housing rights, as indeed also the UNCHR in their understanding of adequate housing understands housing justice? Or is it something more? Within our work, we defined housing justice as adequate housing for all, so in a way also leaving no one behind, and it's housing that is available, accessible, affordable, acceptable, and adaptable for all in an equitable, inclusive, and sustainable way. And how do we achieve that? What is equitable? We've been talking here today also about certain groups of tenants, for instance, getting extra care, getting extra protection. But what is equitable? When is everybody achieved? It's not about providing the same solutions for everybody, but giving everybody an equitable chance to participate and to have access to housing. Inclusive, from social justice, we find a lot of understandings when cities are inclusive. But how do we really achieve this? And how do we achieve this in a sustainable way? That's why we started to build this framework. And with this framework, we're now conducting a lot of research. Also, a lot of students have been working around this. And it's still very much evolving. I'm not going to give you the answer here to why to achieve housing justice. We are all working towards it, just as you are. And just as the SDGs wants us to achieve, because I think if we achieve adequate housing and if we leave no one behind, we achieve housing justice. So if we look at unpacking those 5 A's, I'll start off with how we have unpacked it so far. But as I explained to you, it's an evolving approach, it's an evolving mechanism. So what I would also challenge you to do is, if you at all pick something up from these 5A approach, is really also to look at it, but how did it work for me? I'm still working, actually, on the St. Maarten case, and we're really using this also as a mechanism there. So if we want to improve the social housing sector in St. Maarten, which is politically extremely difficult, still, how do we ensure that those 5 principles, how do they indeed come to fruit? So availability. Availability can mean many ways, and it really depends on your local situation and on the local solutions that you need when housing is made available. Availability could simply be the number of housing units. But if I look at the country I live in, the Netherlands, actually the amount of units in the country equals the amount of households that we have. Yet, still, probably a lot of Dutch people will agree with me that there is still a need for an increased housing, because it's about also where is it, what locations is it, and where is also the housing located vis-a-vis, for instance, job opportunities. If you looked at some of the examples I showed, for instance, from Myanmar, those houses that are newly built, they're really at the periphery of the city. People will not be able to afford to actually go and access amenities and to go and find jobs, to go and access jobs in the cities, because they're very far off located. So it's also the availability of land. We already talked here about land, and obviously the availability of finance. Ironically enough, the availability of finance is also the biggest threat, and I think that's what's clearly been said here too. And availability is also about understanding housing needs. What people need where. And I think one thing that actually in the countries I've been working a lot in the Global South is also availability of tenure choice. Many countries across the world, when we talk about rental housing, as Claudio was also saying, it's not an acceptable option for many governments. It's not considered a real option, but it is. And we should be able to provide much more choice. So when we talk about availability, for instance, we have this project. This is actually from the Roma project we worked on in Kosovo. So social housing is being realized. But again, this is social housing being realized at the very outskirts of the city, with actually no access to amenities, with a long journey away from any job opportunities. So housing is being provided, housing is made available, but is this adequate housing? I think a little bit more is needed. Then comes accessibility, and the accessibility ties into what we just saw. It's about access to housing. Yes, people were provided access to housing, but where also? Where is that access provided? When it comes to the Roma population, and this is across the Balkan a problem, maybe the accessibility is for housing we just realize at the periphery, where there's no access to those services. And also the access, and this was shown by the Roma experience, is about for whom is it accessible? Social housing in many countries, for instance, is really restricted to civil servants only, or maybe war veterans, or people with really special needs or certain disabilities, but it's maybe not widely available across the board. To hear today that in Vienna, what was it? I've forgotten now the percentage, but I think it was around 80% of the people can access affordable housing. There's many countries where policies are far more restricted, and that accessibility to affordable housing that is being provided by states, so affordable housing that is not just being provided by the market, but really as an affordable housing solution promoted by states, is only available to very small portions of society. Not necessarily a bad thing, but if we want to leave no one behind, we are leaving people behind. So here, for instance, this is an example from Caracas, and it's from a colleague of mine that I've worked with. He worked a lot in Venezuela and Caracas. You see actually that the only access people have in the city of Caracas, the only access that poor people have to affordable housing is to build and create their own housing at the outskirts of the city, at extremely difficult building locations. And why is it? Why are they pushed to the borders of the city? Well, predominantly, it comes back to affordability. And what is that affordability? Affordability, I mean, the easy way to say is obviously it's your amount of income spent on housing. And if we look at how we often look at affordability, that's how we calculate it. How much can people actually afford in terms of their income on housing? I'm sure you all also look at the different types of tenure. Whether you're a tenant or whether you're a homeowner says something quite different also about what you can afford in terms of your housing product. When governments provide, and this is not so common in the European countries and most countries you're representing, but when governments provide sites and service projects where people incrementally have to develop housing, affordability starts to mean something else, because you're just starting with the standard unit. And is that sufficient, or should you be able to transform and develop this over time? And affordability also, there's a lot of discussions also in academia about, but how do we calculate it? What is included? And if we look at affordable housing programs, is it about the amount of income that people can spend on housing? Or is it the amount of money left after all the other necessary expenses that people can actually genuinely spend on housing? Coming from the Netherlands, we don't have so much energy poverty yet, but I used to work a lot in the Central and Eastern European countries. Now, these are countries where people spent, former Soviet countries, people spent relatively little on housing as such, because often they're actually homeowners, they got their house for very little, or on a very small mortgage that they might still have outstanding. But the costs on energy are tremendous. And obviously heating is a very important issue there. But I think it's also, I hear there's some people from the UK, I think that's another country where already the issue of energy is very particular. So, sorry, it came back twice. I really do like this project. So this is the project again from Johannesburg. So this is where the affordability is really enshrined in that housing ladder. So it's first of all, it's a housing block with all sorts of amenities. It's also a project where it links in it's run by a social housing organization. They manage it together with a local NGO, a faith-based organization in their case. And they also run a lot of job support programs. So there's different training activities happening to enable people also to find jobs, because ultimately income is an important element to be able to afford housing. But this is also the project where they have that ladder. So if you look now at the far end here, you actually see units that are rented out as 2-bedroom apartments. If for whatever reason you see a drop in income or an inconvenience happens to you, you may be able to move into shared accommodation again. Not ideal, but you remain at the same location within the same community with the same support services available to you. So this housing ladder, obviously what we all like to do and what we strive for, and I'm the same, and you're probably the same as me on this, is generally we would like to walk up our housing ladder. We don't like to shift down, but reality sometimes forces us to do something else. So then it comes to acceptability, and I think, and I don't know enough, to be honest, about your organization that you're representing, but I'm sure this is something that should much speak to you, because what is acceptable? What is acceptable solutions of housing for people to live in? And already it has come up a couple of times. It's about the quality of housing outcomes. It's the quality of those houses. And whether they also really address real housing needs. Because, for instance, I was showing you that example, which I like a lot, where people may live in sort of shared accommodation forms. There are many cities or countries or localities or communities where this is unacceptable. When we were working on the housing strategy for Roma populations across the Balkans, talking about maybe communal housing structures was an acceptable option. I also worked on the housing strategy for the United Arab Emirates. That's a different story. Communal housing, well, even within the standalone freestanding, affordable, social government-provided affordable housing units. Even blocks for women and men should be separate. So what are the housing needs? And what is acceptable to people depends a lot on cultural adequacy. It's the outcome and the expression of a cultural identity, and this will differ across the world, but this will also differ within a certain locality for the different cultures that you will find in these localities. So how you define acceptability and how you understand that will differ a lot. So here, for instance, and in the understanding of acceptability, what plays an important role there is the participation of the community, is to understand what people's need. So in this particular project from Sri Lanka, people really could play a role. They were given a basic starter unit, and then they had a role to play in how that would evolve. So involving a community is really one of the key aspects to achieve this acceptability of housing. And then there were 5 A's, so you're still missing one. Well, in times of climate change, obviously one of the key issues that also needs to be addressed in adequate housing has to be adaptability. Adaptability to attain sustainability objectives. In the European context, we would talk a lot about energy efficiency, energy transition, energy resilience. But this again, this depends on, I showed you the example from St. Maarten, the hurricane proofing. Well, I don't think in the Netherlands we're fair water too, but in a very different way. But adaptability of housing is key. Because also, let us not forget, when it comes to housing, this is not a short-term solution. This is where, when it comes to housing being a commodity, yes, it's a commodity, but it's a commodity that's very fixed, and it's there for a very long time in many cases. So when it's there for a very long time, adaptability becomes a very key issue. So here an example from the Philippines, where the local government units actually play a very active role in achieving affordable housing. What they did is in this area where there's a lot of issues with hurricanes and typhoons and so on, is the flooding is a regular occurring pattern. So they made these are affordable local government houses. They raised them, and hence it's much more adaptable now also to climate change and to the climate disasters that is affecting them. So with this, we come to what we then call the 5A principles of adequate housing. How you define those 5 principles, whether they're used, we use them. At the IHS, we use them to conduct our research. We use them as a model also to provide advice. We see students in our master thesis, we see them using it, and we see them finding indicators that match the local markets, that match the local understandings. I had a student graduating who looks at how gentrification is in particular affecting elderly people. But in Zambia, and I can assure you that the mechanisms are very similar, for instance, to how elderly people are being affected by gentrification, maybe across Europe or the Netherlands. But some of the outcomes are rather different. But like any blueprint model, this is not a model, it's a generic, it's like the SDGs. It's an overall model, it's 5 principles, but it's not like it fits all. You have to make it adaptable, and it can only work if you shape it for the local context. So we keep on using it to evaluate housing policies and programs, in a way also to see how we can reach that target 11, or target the SDG 11, and the target 1 in particular around housing. So with this, we hope to really evolve also into a model that can really bring an understanding how can we achieve adequate housing and how we can achieve housing justice, and how that can help also in addressing housing policies that for a very long time, housing policies was about enabling the market. We made that change, we made that turn. Housing policies are now about housing rights, but how do we achieve that? How do we leave no one behind? There is still that question, housing justice, and I hope we'll find that.
Thank you so much, Ellen. This just proves how inspiring it can be when we work together with academics, which we in IUT try to do a lot. And I think what I'm going to take away from this, apart from the 5 A's, which I think we can all use, is what Ellen said about involving the community, and that's what we all need to carry on doing. And of course, I think today's theme is housing justice for all of us, and that's what everybody has talked about. So thank you to all the speakers, to all the organizers. And tomorrow we start with registrations at 9, and then tomorrow you all get to speak to each other because we have a lot of round tables and very short speeches. It's sort of speed speaking from the 6 speakers tomorrow. So see you all at 7 o'clock tonight, and thank you for being here today.